I wanted to make a video on Dead Rising's most over-hated character. However, Gary is a Dead Rising 3 character, and this is not a Dead Rising 3 video, so he'll have to wait. Don't worry, big guy, I'll get to you someday.
Okay. Don't leave me hanging here.
So, sticking to the first Dead Rising, let me talk about the game's most over-hated character, Otis. Otis is often hated for his gameplay mechanics, particularly how he always interrupts you at the worst possible time. But take the time to read his dialogue. He may not actually have a voice actor, but he consistently gets the best lines in the game. My personal favorite is when he reminds you about your promise to Isabella, where he tells Frank that they both know how women get when you break a promise, so Frank should light a fire under his ass ASAP. It's really fitting that he tells Frank he owes him a beer. He's the improbably level-headed guy at the local bar, just happy to talk about life. Okay, I'm done dragging you along. Although I could have kept this bit going for Isabella and Barnaby, this is a video about Jessica. But it's not just comedic misdirection that had me putting off the subject matter. Most discussion on her amounts to, Jessica doesn't get to do anything. She twists her ankle, hands Frank her gun, and sits in the security room until she dies. I'm not going to pretend that by the end of this video, Jessica's going to become your new favorite character, but I hope to give you an appreciation for what she adds to the game that no one else seems interested in actually talking about. Chief among them, nobody seems to bring up that Jessica is why we have the single most famous line in the franchise.
I've covered wars, you know.
I don't think any other character could have gotten this line out of Frank. He doesn't really talk to Otis or Barnaby so much as he just listens to him, and Brad is off the table right away. The leading part of their interaction is that Brad doesn't take Frank too seriously, and the firefight with Carlito would hardly be the best time to drop it. Actually, the same goes for any given psychopath in the game. Frank could say it to Brad after the fight, or it could be said to Isabella when they start properly talking, but then it loses its effect. If Frank mentions that he's never fired at a person first, and only then brings up that he's covered wars, it'll come across as a lie at best, and a contradiction at worst. But since he talks to Jessie about it first, the two lines together give the intended effect. Frank covered the war on terror, but he never had to actually fire at someone. The dynamic between Frank and Jessie is that they both hold themselves above the other, and both are justified in doing so in their eyes. Jessica is having some random civilian trying to assert himself into a matter of homeland security for little more than a paycheck, and Frank is a wartime journalist being patronized as if he's just some pencil pusher by a pencil pusher. In comparison, Frank has always had to push Brad for information or a willingness to let him tag along, and when talking to Isabella, Frank actually does have the upper hand in most interactions. This early game dynamic is what makes Jessica the best and possibly only good choice to deliver this iconic line. But okay, enough about her contributions to meme culture. What about the story itself? Well, Jessica is the character that makes it clear that this is a mystery story, not strictly a survival story. Carlito was suspicious when Frank landed on the rooftop, but that could be written off as Carlito knowing about the zombies and toying with Frank. At most, some people might piece together that Carlito was Frank's original source, and he was waiting for him to arrive. There's certainly a mystery around Carlito himself, but nothing to immediately suggest that he's involved in the situation at large. Same goes for Isabella in the entrance. Brad initially answers Frank's question, but then ignores him to leave. Again, more of a mystery around the character than the situation. It's Jessie's explicit denial of information, and her interest in Dr. Barnaby's picture and Frank's camera, that will make it clear that this is not just zombies overrunning a mall, which actually becomes more of a footnote by this point. This scene is quickly followed by their meeting in the warehouse, where Frank says,
I've covered wars, you know.
First, a nice detail is that as Jessica falls over, she keeps her gun pointed at Frank. But just before Frank delivers his iconic line, there's this important exchange.
I've gotta help Brad, or he's done for.
Alright, fine. Give me your gun. Come on. I'm the reason you just got hurt. Let me help.
No, I can't let a civilian do that. That's against regulations.
Yeah, well, I don't think they had zombie-infested malls in mind when they wrote those regulations, kid.
We get to see that Frank is not unreasonable and can be empathetic, but he doesn't want to be patronized and will call people out. Jessie allows Frank to show this part of his personality better than anyone else in the game does, thanks to the aforementioned dynamic. And by the way, If it was just Otis calling Frank on the transceiver, even if it was in a cutscene, Frank loses any personal motivation in saving Brad. It's no longer because he got someone hurt and is taking their place. An old man who told him to not go in the mall in the first place is now just telling him the guy who was deliberately ignoring him needs help. Getting back to that warehouse conversation, she gives Frank her gun to go save Brad, giving him the most important thing that a main character needs at the start of a story: a direction to go in. Take Jessie out of the scene, or the story at large, and Frank is left to just wander the mall until the player takes him to the food court. And naturally, you want to give the player a sense of direction before they go into the action properly. That's just common open world design. This actually happens quite frequently throughout the story with Jessica. When they fail to get Barnaby out of the bookstore, Jessie is the one with the cell phone that gives a line back to HQ, so they have a reason to head back to the security room, which organically lets the player get to the warehouse when the queens are introduced. Her interviewing Dr. Barnaby on her own without Frank forces him to find Isabella, effectively kicking off the second half of the game. When Frank gets Isabella back to the hideout, Jessica finding Carlito on the monitors naturally informs Frank of what's happening, while also giving the player a chance to, again, return to the security room, fulfilling any survivor requests they haven't yet. So on and so forth. A more subtle example of this happening is when Frank offers to get medicine for Jessica. First, Frank offers to do this merely hearing that's what Brad needs. Jessica technically never asks him to. This reinforces the idea that Frank is not an apathetic sociopath by default. It also sets up Frank's lack of medical know-how, which is quickly applied when meeting Tanya and Ross. It also foreshadows why Carlito would shoot Isabella. Isabella storms off in Case 2 without getting any medicine, and there's no proof she ever found some on her second trip to the supermarket. So Carlito, who's been trying to avenge his entire village, has been running a possibly triple-digit fever for what is the better part of 24 hours by now, and is then asked to be interviewed by the two guys who have been constantly foiling him. I go over all of this because one of the complaints towards Jessie is that she could be removed from the game and have her roles given to Brad or Otis. In case this isn't already apparent, I think that's ridiculous. Is Brad supposed to try and interview Barnaby on his own while he's still recovering from a gunshot wound? And I'm saying this as somebody who actually used to think Jessica was a replaceable character a few years back. But taking the time to actually pay attention to her role in the story shows that she does really need to be there. But there's the other criticism she constantly receives. The idea that they wasted her character potential, and she deserved to do more in the story. Let's put aside the various actions and interactions I've already brought up. What's the endgame of this idea? I get the elevator pitch of having Jessie engage in combat as Brad does, the most literal take on equality and such. But what is the story supposed to do? From Reddit posts to TV tropes and the Dead Rising wiki forums, it's not hard to find someone giving this particular critique to Jessica, that she was somehow shortchanged. But it's rare to find an actual solution brought up, because the only way to do so is to stretch out the storyline so she can be forced into combat, or to have her replace Brad at certain points during a boss fight. So do you force another situation between the bomb run and Larry to get Jessica into the action? Or does she replace Brad in one of the two fights? The best answer I ever heard was having her join Brad for Carlito's second round. Still, it wouldn't achieve much other than giving Carlito another person to shoot at during the fight, and it would actually make it harder to justify him escaping the battle. Jessica would have to be a worse shot than Frank, or be too slow to catch up to him and Brad after Carlito is defeated. And Brad is already able to limp his way back to the security room, albeit painfully, so her supporting him would only really improve the story to those who are too proud to have a suspension of disbelief. Putting Jessie in that fight wouldn't ruin the story, but it's the best case scenario I ever found, and it's a trade-off at best. Jessica gets some action, but looks less competent at letting Carlito escape. That's why I asked, what is the endgame? As it stands, Jessie and Brad are a good contrast for each other. Visually, Brad is an older, bald black man with one of the most muscular builds in the entire game, only really beaten out by Cliff, who has a vibrant outfit, while Jessica is a younger, blonde, curvaceous woman with a monochrome color scheme. Brad is the experienced agent between the two and is careful with his wording and approach, going out into the field to directly solve conflicts. Meanwhile, Jessica is the rookie agent who is more blunt and to the point, a bit snarky as a result, and serves as the mission control to inform Frank and Brad of what's going on in terms of the plot. Even their demises are inverted in contrast. Brad dies in a dark, zombie-filled underground tunnel, with the presence of Frank before he dies while coming to terms with his fate, while Jessie is alone in the brightly lit security room. left in despair and disbelief about the situation. Frank ultimately doesn't get any last words with her. These differences are why the idea that Jessica has wasted potential falls apart for me. Maybe there's better arguments out there than the ones I've read, but all I end up reading are people who want to turn her into a second Brad, so there's an action woman in the game besides Isabella. The game doesn't need two Brads, but it greatly benefits from having a Brad and a Jessie. And that's why Jessie can't just be dropped and have her roles given to Brad or Otis. Neither of them can fill roles in the story beyond the broadest of strokes. Jessie is not my favorite character in the story, but it's sad to see how often in online discussions she gets written off as little more than fan service, when she's the stable force of the story, the only character who's there till literally the bitter end. For all the talk about Jessie not having enough to do, a lot of people tend to not bring up that Brad spends a fourth of the game sleeping off a bullet wound, and spends another fourth of the game being dead. Isabella is just walking foreshadowing until the second half of the game, and Barnaby only exists for exposition and to give Carlito a target, and all of that is fine. Every character in this story does their job and does it well, Jessie included. I don't blame anybody who doesn't find Jessica to be particularly memorable compared to Brad or Isabella or Frank, but she is irreplaceable. And sadly, a lot of people don't appreciate that.